The restaurant was packed that night, alive with the soft clinking of crystal glasses, the shimmer of chandeliers, and the low hum of laughter that only money could buy. Every table was dressed in white linen, golden candlelight flickering across silverware polished to perfection. The air smelled of perfume, red wine, and roasted truffle butter. To the guests, it was just another night of indulgence. But behind that elegance was a heartbeat, Maya, a young black waitress working her second double shift of the week, just trying to keep the lights on in her small apartment across town. Her hands moved with practiced grace, balancing trays heavy with dishes that cost more than her daily pay. Her black shoes pinched her feet, and every step made her calves burn. But you'd never know it. Her smile never faded, not even when someone snapped their fingers for water instead of calling her name, not even when a table ignored her "good evening" like she was invisible. Maya had learned something long ago, that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you carry, quietly, like a flame that no one can put out. That night, the corner table by the tall glass window belonged to a group of regulars, the kind who believed their wealth gave them permission to be cruel. They were loud, smug, and loud enough that everyone in the room could hear them. At the center of it all sat Victoria Langford, a socialite whose smile was famous in magazines, and whose heart, it seemed, was made of ice. Victoria was the type who made waiters nervous before they even reached her table. She loved being admired, feared, and never questioned. Maya approached with her notepad, her step steady, her head high. "Good evening," she said softly, her voice like a calm melody in the chaos. "Welcome back to Liora. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Victoria looked up slowly, her eyes narrowing as they scanned Maya from head to toe, from her simple ponytail to her scuffed shoes. Then, with a smirk, she turned to her friends and said, "Oh, they're letting anyone serve here these days." Her tone was coated in sugar, but it dripped with poison. Her friends laughed, tossing glances at Maya like she was part of the evening's entertainment. For a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. The laughter, the music, all of it disappeared under the weight of that cruel comment. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or walk away. She just smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried both strength and grace. "What can I get for you tonight?" she asked softly. Her voice was gentle, but firm, the kind of tone that made people like Victoria uncomfortable, because it didn't match what they expected. They wanted her to be angry, humiliated, or broken. But Maya refused to play that part. She refused to shrink to fit their story. Victoria blinked, caught off guard by her composure. "I suppose we'll start with champagne," she said, waving her manicured hand like royalty. "And make sure it's the Dom Perignon, not that cheap bottle you served us last time." "Yes, ma'am," Maya replied, scribbling it down. Her face gave nothing away. But inside, she could feel her pulse quicken, not from anger, but from something deeper. A quiet determination. A promise to herself that no matter how people treated her, she'd never let them change her spirit. As she walked away, Victoria leaned closer to her friends and whispered loudly enough for Maya to hear, "You know, my father used to say you can always tell a person's place by the way they serve. Some people just belong under others." Her friends erupted in laughter again, the sound sharp and cruel. Maya kept walking, head high, back straight. She'd heard worse. She'd seen worse. The world could try to humiliate her, but she had learned long ago that people like Victoria only felt tall when someone else was forced to kneel. Behind the bar, Maya exhaled slowly and fixed her hair. "You're doing fine," she whispered to herself. "Just one more night. Just keep going." But there was something different in her eyes, a glimmer that hadn't been there before. Because what Victoria didn't know, was that Maya's story wasn't one of pity. It was one of quiet power waiting to be seen. She returned to the table, champagne tray balanced perfectly in her hands. She poured each glass with precision, her movements elegant, her silence steady. Every flick of her wrist said what words couldn't: "You can insult me, but you can't define me." And as Victoria watched her, that fake smile faltered just for a second. There was something unsettling about Maya, not her appearance, but her presence. She carried herself like someone who knew exactly who she was, and that terrified people who built their worth on making others feel small. By the time Maya turned to leave, the laughter at the table had grown quieter. Even Victoria sat back, eyes narrowed, unsure why she suddenly felt smaller. Because sometimes, power doesn't shout. Sometimes, it walks quietly in the form of a woman who refuses to bow. The night stretched on, and with every glass of champagne, Victoria's cruelty grew sharper. The more she drank, the more her laughter cut through the air like glass. Her voice grew louder, her words meaner. It wasn't enough that Maya served with grace, Victoria needed to break her spirit too. "Tell me, Maya," Victoria said, swirling her glass lazily, "is this your dream job? Or did life just not give you better options?" The table erupted in laughter. Maya smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She didn't answer. She just stood with her tray held steady, every muscle in her body fighting to stay calm. Victoria wasn't finished. "I mean, you do have a nice smile," she went on, smirking. "That must help you get tips, right? Smile for us, sweetheart, it makes the service feel a little more cheerful." Her friends chuckled again, feeding off her arrogance like a pack of wolves around a single flame. The sound of their laughter filled the restaurant, cutting through the music and chatter. Maya felt her cheeks burn. For a second, she wanted to disappear, to run to the back room, to hide where no one could see her. But she didn't move. She drew a slow, quiet breath, and she smiled, not the smile they wanted, but the one she chose. It was small, calm, full of quiet pride. Because Maya knew something they didn't: sometimes the strongest people in the room are the ones who don't fight back, they rise above. She leaned forward slightly to place a tray of wine glasses on the table, her movements as smooth and careful as ever. But in that moment, Victoria's lips curled into a mischievous grin. She reached out suddenly, grabbing the edge of Maya's apron. "Oh, let me help you, sweetheart," she said mockingly. There was a sharp, ripping sound, loud and terrible, cutting through the air like a scream. Maya froze. Her entire body went still. The tray trembled in her hands. The soft fabric of her dress had torn straight down the back seam, the noise echoing through the room louder than the clinking glasses and piano music combined. For one horrifying second, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that seemed to swallow the entire restaurant. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Then came the laughter. It started small, a snicker from one of Victoria's friends, but soon it spread like wildfire. Chairs shifted. Someone at another table tried to hide a smile. Others looked away, pretending not to watch, but their eyes said everything. Victoria leaned back in her chair, smirking like she'd just won something. "Oh no," she drawled, feigning concern, "did we tear your little costume? Maybe you should wear something stronger next time." Her friends burst out laughing again, the sound cruel and hollow. Maya's hands flew to the back of her dress, clutching the torn fabric against her waist. Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it over the laughter. Every part of her wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she stood there, trembling slightly, but with her chin held high. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even humiliated anymore. What she felt was something deeper, a quiet sorrow for people who could find joy in someone else's pain. The room's energy shifted. Some guests stared at their plates, uncomfortable. A few waiters froze in place, unsure whether to help. Even the manager at the bar hesitated, torn between stepping in and avoiding the wrath of the restaurant's wealthiest customer. Maya's eyes glistened under the dim light, but no tears fell. she refused to give them that satisfaction. With one hand holding her torn dress, she straightened up slowly and said, in a voice soft but steady, "Excuse me." Then she turned away. The laughter echoed behind her, cruel and sharp. But each step she took away from that table made the sound fade a little more, until it was just noise. Just meaningless noise. When she reached the back hallway near the kitchen, she stopped. She took a deep breath, her fingers still gripping the fabric. The mirror on the wall caught her reflection, hair messy, eyes tired, dress ruined. But even then, she was beautiful in a way none of them could understand. She whispered to herself, "You're stronger than this. Don't let them see you break." And she didn't. She took another breath, lifted her chin, and returned to her duties like nothing had happened, the picture of grace in the face of cruelty. But deep down, a storm was brewing. Not in her, but in someone else. Someone who had just walked through the restaurant doors moments ago. Someone who had seen everything. Then, a deep voice cut through the laughter like thunder slicing through a storm. "Is there a problem here?" Every sound in the restaurant died. Forks stopped clinking. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the pianist at the corner missed a note. Heads turned toward the entrance. There, framed by the golden glow of the chandelier, stood a man. Tall. Composed. Impossibly calm, the kind of calm that carried danger behind it. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit him like it had been sewn just for him. His jaw was strong, his stance effortless but commanding. And his eyes, those sharp, steady eyes swept across the room and locked instantly on Maya. Her breath hitched. For the first time that night, she felt her knees go weak, not from fear, but from recognition. It was Elijah. Her husband. No one else in the restaurant knew who he was yet, but in that instant, the atmosphere changed. You could feel it. The laughter dissolved into awkward silence. The air grew heavy, like everyone had just realized they might have made a terrible mistake. The manager, a small nervous man in a bow tie, rushed over, whispering frantically, "Sir, please, I can handle this." But Elijah didn't even glance at him. His focus never left Maya. He walked across the floor slowly, his shoes echoing on the marble tiles with every step. People moved out of his way without knowing why, instinctively, like they could sense power in his presence. When he reached her, he said nothing for a moment. He just looked at her, at the torn dress, the trembling hands clutching it, the tears glistening in her eyes. Then, quietly, he slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice low and full of concern. Maya nodded, unable to speak. The tears that had refused to fall before now welled up in her eyes, not from shame, but from something far deeper. Relief. Love. Safety. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Everyone was watching, too stunned to move. But not Victoria. She leaned back in her chair, trying to recover her confidence, swirling her wine as if the moment didn't bother her. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice sharp but trembling underneath. Elijah turned his gaze toward her, calm, steady, unreadable. When he spoke, his tone was quiet. But his words carried the weight of thunder. "Her husband," he said evenly. Then, after a heartbeat, "and the majority owner of this restaurant." The silence that followed was suffocating. You could almost hear the sound of hearts dropping. Victoria blinked, the color draining from her face. Her friends shifted awkwardly in their seats, eyes darting around, hoping the floor would swallow them whole. The manager froze mid-step, his face pale as parchment. The waiters by the bar stopped moving entirely. Elijah's words hung in the air like judgment. The same people who had laughed seconds ago were now whispering to each other, their voices trembling. The arrogance in the room had vanished, replaced by guilt, fear, and regret. Victoria forced out a shaky laugh. "Oh, well, we were just joking." You know how it is. But Elijah didn't blink. Joking? His voice was calm, but each word was like a blade. You humiliate a woman, my wife, in public, and call it a joke? Victoria stammered, I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to. Elijah stepped closer, not shouting, not raising his voice, but every person in that restaurant felt the gravity of his words. Do you know how hard she works? How much dignity it takes to keep smiling when people treat her like that? You think kindness is weakness? The entire room was silent. Victoria's eyes darted toward her friends for help, but they had already turned away, ashamed. One of them muttered, Victoria, let's just go. Elijah looked around the room, scanning the faces that had once laughed. All of you saw it, he said, voice quiet but cold. And you did nothing. That's the real shame here. Maya lowered her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks now, not from pain, but from the strength in his voice. Elijah turned back to her gently, cupping her face for a brief moment. You don't ever have to face this kind of cruelty alone, he said softly. Then he looked at the manager. Fire every person at that table from your guest list. Permanently. No exceptions. The manager nodded instantly. Yes, sir. Right away. Victoria stood up, face flushed, words tumbling out, you can't do this. Oh, I can, Elijah said, his voice calm as ever. And I just did. He turned back to Maya, offering his arm. Come on, he said gently. Let's go home. As they walked toward the door, the restaurant fell utterly silent. The same people who had laughed at her now lowered their eyes in shame. The chandeliers glittered overhead, casting light across the floor like a spotlight on redemption. And for the first time that night, Maya walked tall, not just as a waitress, but as a woman who had faced cruelty and stood unbroken. As the doors closed behind them, the quiet voice of one diner whispered what everyone else was thinking. She married him, God help anyone who disrespects her again. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in the restaurant gave his every word the weight of thunder. You came here as guests, he said slowly, his deep voice echoing across the marble floors, but you treated someone who served you with kindness as if she were beneath you. No one dared move. Even the air felt frozen. Waiters stood at the edges of the room, clutching trays that suddenly felt too heavy. Diners who had been laughing moments earlier sat in absolute stillness, staring at the man before them, the man whose calmness was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. My wife, Elijah continued, glancing at Maya beside him, has worked here quietly for months. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to understand the people who make this place what it is. A soft murmur rippled through the staff at the back, disbelief, pride, awe. Some of them had no idea that the kind, smiling waitress they'd worked beside was married to the owner of the restaurant. Others had suspected she was someone special, but never like this. Elijah looked around the room, his expression unreadable. And what she's shown me tonight, he said, his tone lowering just a little, is that respect is not about wealth, or power, or how loudly you can laugh at someone else's pain. He paused, letting the words sink in. It's about character. Victoria sat rigid in her seat, her earlier arrogance now trembling beneath her forced composure. Her friends had already dropped their gazes, cheeks flushed with shame. The weight of Elijah's presence seemed to press down on them all. I didn't mean, Victoria began, her voice faltering. But Elijah turned his eyes to her, calm, piercing, final. You did. The two words hit like a verdict. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just said them with such quiet certainty that they left no room for denial. And now, he added, you can leave. The manager, a man who only minutes ago had been too afraid to intervene, swallowed hard and gave a tiny nod. Yes, sir. His voice shook slightly. Security, please escort them out. 2 uniformed men appeared almost instantly, not rough or aggressive, but firm. Victoria's friends stood first, hurriedly grabbing their handbags, not daring to meet anyone's eyes. Their laughter from earlier seemed like a sin that echoed too loudly now in their own ears. One of them whispered, "Let's just go," and another muttered, "This is humiliating." Victoria sat frozen for a second longer, as if refusing to believe this was really happening. Then, without a word, she rose. Her once perfect smile had vanished. Her eyes, which had gleamed with superiority, now looked small and frightened. She tried to open her mouth again, but nothing came out. As she passed Elijah and Maya, she slowed, maybe searching for sympathy, maybe forgiveness, but Maya simply looked back at her with quiet dignity. No hate. No triumph. Just peace. That hurt more than any insult could. The security guards opened the glass doors, and the night air spilled in, cool and sharp. Victoria and her friends walked out without a word, their heels clicking like tiny echoes of defeat. Then the doors closed. And the laughter that had once filled the restaurant was gone. What replaced it was silence, not empty silence, but heavy, reflective silence. The kind that changes people. Maya stood there, Elijah's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, her hands gripping the fabric like a lifeline. Her heart was pounding, but for the first time that night, she felt safe. Seen. Respected. Elijah turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't owe them anything," he murmured. "Not even anger." She looked up at him, eyes shimmering. "I know," she said quietly. "But I hope they remember tonight, not for what happened to me, but for what they became in the process." He smiled faintly, pride flickering across his face. "They will." From across the room, one of the waiters suddenly started clapping. Just once, softly. Then another joined in. And another. Soon, the sound grew, gentle, heartfelt applause from the very people who had witnessed everything. Not the loud, meaningless kind that fades in seconds, but slow, sincere claps filled with respect. Maya's eyes widened, emotion rising in her throat. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but this wasn't humiliation. This was acknowledgement. Elijah turned toward the staff and nodded. "This place," he said, "belongs to you as much as it does to me. It's built on your effort, your kindness, your grace. Never forget that." A few waitresses wiped their eyes. The manager bowed his head slightly. Even the pianist, who had stopped playing mid-song, pressed his hands gently against the keys again, soft, slow notes drifting through the room like forgiveness in the air. Maya looked at the door one last time, then at her husband. "Let's go home," she whispered. Elijah nodded. As they walked toward the exit together, side by side, the staff and guests stood quietly, not out of fear, but out of respect. And for the first time in that restaurant's long history, people didn't talk about the food, or the wine, or the luxury. They talked about what they had witnessed. A moment when humility defeated cruelty, when quiet grace became power, and when one woman reminded everyone what true dignity looks like. When the restaurant finally began to settle again, Elijah turned his gaze back to the staff. The storm of humiliation and anger that had filled the room only minutes ago had vanished, replaced by a stillness that felt sacred. Every eye was on him, the man who had spoken softly, yet shaken the entire building with his words. He looked around slowly, meeting the eyes of the cooks peeking from the kitchen door, the waiters frozen mid-shift, the manager still clutching his clipboard with trembling hands. "No one," Elijah said firmly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "should ever be made to feel small for doing an honest job." The words sank in, echoing like a truth everyone had always known but needed to hear out loud. "You serve. You clean. You cook. You smile, even when people forget you're human too," he continued, his tone steady but heavy with meaning. "That's not weakness. That's strength. Real strength." Then, slowly, he turned toward Maya. His expression softened, and the hard edge of power in his eyes melted into something gentler: admiration, pride, love. "You've shown me what that strength looks like," he said quietly. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was deep, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was full of emotion, of healing, of respect. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Just one person, a young busboy who had watched everything unfold, his hands still red from hours of scrubbing dishes. The sound was soft at first, uncertain. But soon, another waiter joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire staff was clapping, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of pure respect. And then, to everyone's surprise, the customers began to join. At first, just one table of older guests who looked moved by what they had witnessed. Then another, and another. Soon the applause filled the room, rising like a wave, echoing through the chandeliers and polished walls that had once reflected only arrogance. Maya's eyes widened, her hands trembling slightly as she brought them to her mouth. Tears welled up, not the kind that came from humiliation or pain, but the kind that came from being seen. From being valued. She smiled through them, her lips quivering just a little, and the crowd clapped louder. For the first time, those walls that had heard too much cruelty finally held something beautiful: gratitude. Humanity. Grace. Elijah looked at her, eyes shining with quiet pride. "They're not just clapping for what happened," he said softly, so only she could hear. "They're clapping for you." Later that night, when the restaurant was empty and the applause had faded into memory, the lights dimmed until only the soft golden glow of the chandeliers remained. The staff had gone home. The dishes were washed, the tables cleared, and the city outside hummed with the quiet sounds of midnight. Maya stood alone by the window, the same one where Victoria had sat earlier, laughing, mocking, unaware that she was about to destroy her own dignity instead of someone else's. Maya looked out at the city lights reflecting against the glass. They flickered like tiny stars scattered across the dark sky. She heard footsteps behind her. Strong. Familiar. Elijah walked up quietly, his presence as steady as the heartbeat she'd learned to trust. Without saying a word, he slipped his arms around her waist from behind and rested his chin gently on her shoulder. "You didn't have to come tonight," she whispered, her voice calm, but full of emotion. "I know," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "You handled it yourself. I just wanted them to see what I see every day, a woman who doesn't need power to be powerful. A woman who can turn cruelty into grace." She smiled faintly, leaning back into him. Outside, the city shimmered, alive, imperfect, still full of people who judged too easily and loved too little. But tonight, something had changed. Maya had changed something. The restaurant that once echoed with shallow laughter would never be the same. People would remember her, not the torn dress, not the humiliation, but the way she stood tall in the middle of it all, holding her dignity like armor. Elijah pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know," he murmured, "this place might have my name on it. But you're its heart." She turned to face him, eyes shining. "Then let's make sure it beats for the right reasons," she said softly. He smiled, the kind of smile that said everything words couldn't, and took her hand. Together, they walked toward the door, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty hall like a promise. As they reached the entrance, one of the new waiters still cleaning up paused and looked at them. He nodded respectfully, whispering under his breath, "Good night, Mrs. King." Maya smiled, her hand tightening around Elijah's. And as they stepped into the cool night air, the soft breeze carried away the last traces of mockery and shame, leaving only peace. The staff and few remaining diners who stood near the doorway watched them go, silent, not because they had to be, but because they were in awe. That night, everyone finally understood who Maya truly was. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't even just the owner's wife. She was the soul of that place, the proof that grace could silence cruelty, that quiet dignity could be more powerful than wealth, and that kindness always wins in the end.